Hello, beautiful people. In today's episode, I get the fortune of speaking to Steph Smith, and I first came across Steph's work because she has an incredible blog, which you guys can check out at stephsmith.io. But she is a growth marketer, she's a writer, she's an indie maker, she's a coder, and she currently works for The Hustle and specifically on a team of people who work for a section of The Hustle called Trends. In this episode, we spoke about some of her blog posts about writing, and it was really interesting to hear Steph describe herself not as a writer. She views herself more of herself as a coder, and I thought that was really interesting. So, with that being said, if you enjoyed this episode, let me know on Twitter. @HeyDanny Miranda is where to find me. You can let me know what you think of the episode. Let me know if you love it, if you hate it. Either way, can't wait to hear what you have to say about it. And let's get right into it.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself for people who don't know who Steph Smith is?
Sure. So I guess I could do a bunch of things, but full-time I work for a company called The Hustle, and people might recognize them for their daily email, but I actually work on their premium product, which is called Trends, and I started off there writing for Trends. Now I lead the product. So I do that in terms of my full-time job and have been working in marketing for a while. But in addition to that, I love just following my curiosity and creating things. So I write for my own blog. I write about anything from remote work to learning to code, things like that. I also taught myself to code, so I create little projects every now and then with code. And what else do? I think that's a good summary of the types of things that I'm interested in. And I guess one thing that some people know me for is I've been nomadic also for the last 4 years. So I've been traveling the world as I do all of those things.
Very, very cool. And the first thing that I want to touch on with you is the writing, because just from personal curiosity, you started your blog in late 2018, I think right before 2019 started, and then it seems like your blog kind of exploded in 2019 from what I understand. Why do you think that was, that it was just 1 year of writing and all of a sudden you're everywhere, it seemed like?
Yeah, I it's funny because when you look back, you can always, create reasons and try to align what happened to why you think it happened. I can give a couple ideas, but obviously, if people do exactly what I did, it's no guarantee that they'll get the same result. But some of the reasons that I think it kind of grew faster than most people would expect, or I even expected, is because one, in addition to writing prior to that, I was building a bunch of those projects that I mentioned before with coding. And so right before launching the blog, not even intentionally, I had been building up an audience, right? And so people were listening when I started to write. And so I almost had a core audience ready to read my stuff when I started writing, versus when most people start writing, they have no one listening, and it takes much longer for them to get that kind of critical mass to pay attention. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think has really helped me is I talk about this concept of where basically, it's very hard from just like a purely effort perspective to work full time and also create things on the side. But the beauty of that I found, and I've been doing this for years now, is that because I get my kind of financial stability from my job, then I don't have to worry about monetizing. I don't have to worry about writing things that I hope people will find value from. I just write about things that I personally find interesting. Again, the idea of following your curiosity. And because I can do that, I can write about stuff that I know super well. I can write about things only every so often, only when I actually feel like I have value to provide. And for that reason, I had always focused on with everything, focusing on only producing things of quality and only producing things when I thought people could get value for them. And for that reason, even though there's people who publish, multiple times a week per se, in 2019, which was really, again, that year that I launched, I had written no more than 20 articles. I think it was like 16 articles or something. But every single one I wrote only when I felt like, again, it could deliver value. And for that reason, I think 4 or so of them ended up trending on Hacker News and stuff like that. So I guess to get back to your original question, the reason that I think my blog grew so quickly, among many other things, was because I already had people listening by nature of building an audience through my products earlier. And then second, because I focused on this idea of quality and only creating things that I thought would deliver value, even though I didn't publish a ton, when I did publish, people were really interested in engaging with the content.
Makes a lot of sense. And I started to go through your book that you just published, Doing Content Right, and I went through it and last night, and I actually felt there's so much information in there that I actually felt overwhelmed. I've been putting out content for the past 6 months on my blog, and I just sat there and I was like, oh my God, I'm doing so much wrong, or like there's so much information here. And I was like, oh my God, like there's so much here. So can you talk a little bit about like how you managed to put so much in one book? Like I'm saying that as a positive, it was really incredible.
Thanks. Yeah. So one of the things that I mentioned in the book is this concept that like, I wrote this book in a very short period of time. But really that book was like a manifestation of learning all these things over the last, I would say, at least 3+ years. So even before I started writing on my own, I was working for a company called TopTal and was leading a publications team there, in which within that team, there were 6 publications we were running. And then I switched to The Hustle, started writing for The Hustle, or for Trends specifically, and then now lead that product. And so in addition to my own curiosity in my own projects, I've been actually either working on or leading publications teams for years. And so even though that, yes, there's a lot of information there, I think you would, if you asked anyone who's been, working on a craft for 3 years to go put it in a book, and you were to show that to anyone else who hadn't been working for 3 years on that exact same craft, they'd be surprised by like, oh my God, you know so much. But it's because, again, they've been spending X many years honing in on that craft. And so, yeah, I think it's funny because a lot of people know me for like my personal projects and my personal blog, but most of the things that I learned and actually, I guess, taught or communicated in that book came from those years where I was doing this professionally, right? And so that's why I think there is a lot more information in there versus perhaps if someone's been doing this on their own, who may know some things, but doesn't know them in different contexts. So that's the final thing I'll add here is I think the reason that I could produce a book like this is because as it relates to content overall, I came from experience in different contexts where I was either a writer for a company versus a writer individually. I knew how to lead a team with content. I knew how to run content teams across different domains, right? So a publication that's more personal versus a publication that's focused on a very, very niche type of expertise. I had kind of gathered that experience across all of those different scenarios and been able to tie them together in this book versus I think many other people, maybe if they're working in content or writing their own personal for themselves, they don't have that breadth of experience. And so that's why I think ultimately the book ended up being so successful is because I did kind of bring in those experiences into kind of one domain.
Yeah. And you know the book is successful, well, as the reader does, because you publish all your stats in terms of what you made from the book and so you do this thing where you're building in public and you're putting your revenue out there in public. And I'm sure knowing you that's intentional, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like why did you from such an early stage, like from the beginning of your blog, really start to put all those stats out in public?
Yeah, great question. So I'll take you all the way back to my first project. So if you were to look at me or know me, actually, let me rephrase this. If you were to go back to 2017 or even early 2018, you would not know who I am because I did not put anything out there. I hadn't created any of these online projects. I hadn't written any books. I wasn't online, in terms of like, I didn't have an active Twitter account or anything like that. So then while I was kind of nomading and all this stuff, I had met a bunch of these people who were building online, people like Peter Levels and stuff like that, and had been inspired by them. And so for that reason, 2018, I decided to learn to code and started putting my projects out there. The reason I'm mentioning this is because with my very first project, it was something called Nomad Hub, which in terms of like idea and like how good the actual site was, complete dud compared to other things that I've created. But I put it out there. I launched it on Product Hunt. I think it did like okay, maybe it was like number 6 or 7 on Product Hunt for the day. But what I noticed is I had rejoined Twitter. I had it in high school, didn't look at it for many years, rejoined it when I launched Nomad Hub. And when I did that, I tweeted about it and Product Hunt retweeted that tweet and it got a lot of attention. But there was something very particular that I noticed, which was people were engaging with this tweet, but they really didn't give a crap about Nomad Hub. It wasn't really solving anyone's problems, and it wasn't something that people wanted. But what they did find interesting was the story. I think the tweet said something along the lines of like, hey, like just spent the last year learning to code. Here's my project. And all of the comments were like, oh my God, I want to learn to code. Or how did you do this? How do I, do the same thing as you, etc. And the point that I'm trying to make, or the thing that I realized at the time, was that people were more interested in the story than the actual product. Now, this isn't always the case, but that really opened my eyes as to, if you are building things closed, right? So no one knows what you're building. People, only can learn about the things that you're building during these launches, right? These like super important launches when everyone's stressed about having the perfect copy on Product Hunt. That's the only chance for you to let people know what you're doing. And then people only care what you're doing if you're only doing these like very specific launches if you're winning. And what I mean by this is if your product is perfect and it serves their needs and all this stuff. However, if you pull back the curtain and you start to share things on a more ongoing basis, the analogy that I like to give is if your car breaks down, then you're more likely to have someone pull over and help you push your car if you're already pushing it, right? So in pulling back this curtain, you're basically showing the world, hey, I'm working on this thing, and people start to want to be part of that story, whether it is they start following you and they read your articles, or they connect you with people. Let's say you have a podcast, they start connecting with people once they understand your goals. And I just started to realize that as you start to build in the open, you don't always need to be quote unquote winning for people to care about you or to want to be part of your story. And so from that very project onward, I had built in the open, whether it was my projects in terms of coding or my articles, just because I had from that juncture started to realize that could benefit me. And then from there forward, just to give a couple of examples, like even with my projects, the next project that I did this 30-day challenge, and I opened that whole process up. The one after that, I did this 24-hour streaming challenge. And all of those just further cemented this idea that even if your stuff is not perfect, in opening things up, you're just allowing people to be part of that story or be part of what you're working on. And personally, I would say that I wouldn't have any of the success, whether it's the book or certain job offers that I've gotten, without actually building in the open.
It's super fascinating. And it leads me to ask the follow-up question of like, how do you deal psychologically when you're not quote unquote winning, when you don't have the successful book or you have a down month? How are you dealing with that psychologically and still being, obviously you put your stats of this is what I'm doing, this is what I did. And so when it doesn't go your way, how do you react to that mentally?
Yeah, I want to mention a couple of things here. So the first one is that in building the open, I gave a presentation on building the open the other day, and someone asked a very good question of like, does that put you at basically more emotional vulnerability because you're putting your stuff out there, and if people aren't listening or you're not doing as well, or your stats don't look great, like does that put you in a more difficult place? And the answer for me is that it actually hasn't. I'm sure there are scenarios where it can. But the way I look at it is, to give another analogy of this building in the open thing, it's like you're not going out there and doing things that you wouldn't normally do. So if let's say we're working in a garage and you're working on all the projects that you would do in that garage, And the equivalent, at least the way I view it, of building the open is that you're just opening that garage door. Now, what you're not doing, and what I think can actually lead to this like emotional vulnerability when you're not doing well, is if you, instead of just doing what you would have done behind closed doors, you go and like you get a big sign, you get fireworks, and you're like, hey, everyone, like, look at what I'm doing, right? That's when I think you can go astray, and that's when I think you can get very disappointed when things aren't going well. So the important part about building the open is you are sharing more stuff. You are trying to, in some ways, get people's attention so that they join you with your story. But you're not doing so in such a way where that's like the end all be all, and you completely revamp your goals and your approach to actually facilitate that. You're just opening the door, right? So that's the first thing that I would mention. The second thing that I would mention is this, to go back to the car analogy, no one can actually, stop and help you push your car unless your car breaks down, right? So this is the whole idea where if you aren't building in the open, people can only support you when you're winning, right? When you're launching, for example, and you have a great product. When you're building in the open, you do have these car breakdowns, but that's actually when people I've seen like tend to help you the most, when they're like, oh, like I've been following Steph's story for a while. I've actually had people, for example, throughout the last year, I haven't been publishing on my personal blog very much, who are like, hey, Steph, like you haven't published, like, is everything okay? And so that's actually really nice, where again, you get that concept of people getting out of their cars to help you because they're invested in your story. And then the final thing I would say there is that one thing that's helped me overall, that's not as focused on building the open, but just overall is integrating this long-term thinking idea. And actually one of my in your life, you have these local minima and maxima that happen all the time. And one of the, I guess, local minima last year was when I hadn't created projects for a while. I was still at my old company and I just felt a little like stalled. And I wrote this article as like, it's my most popular article to date. It's How to Be Great. And because it was a little bit more of like a vulnerable, like, hey, I'm thinking about these things and I haven't produced in a while, but this is how I'm trying to think about it. Again, that's been my most popular article to date. So again, I think building in the open, if you completely shift the way that you approach life in order to build in the open, that's when you can run into some problematic things. But if you're just opening that door, I think actually building in the open can basically like enable you to have a better support system that you wouldn't have if you're just building behind closed doors.
I'm so happy you brought up the How to Be Great article, because it was something I wanted to touch on in this conversation. What did you think about when you were writing this article? Was it just that you were going through a hard time and you wanted to convince yourself to keep going? What was your mindset when writing it?
Yeah, so I think over the last couple of years, especially, right before I had written this, I have talked to a bunch of entrepreneurs. I also, I have my own people that I look up to in business and tech and all this stuff. And the more I learned about their stories, the more I realized that just the way things are represented in media make things seem like overnight successes. And it isn't some like malicious thing. It's more so just like the way our brains work, in that, today I've heard of this company and yesterday I hadn't. So it must be like something must have happened, right? Something significant. When in reality, behind the scenes, those companies or those individuals were really working away for many years and years and years before they reached you. And so the more I had learned about companies, the more I'd studied companies, the more that I had met people, like to give Peter Levels as an example. A lot of people were like, oh, his 12 startups in 12 months, like that's what really took him off. It was just that one thing. Sure, that kind of helped him take off. But before that, he also had been building a bunch of different projects. He also had ups and downs. He also didn't know what he was doing for a very long time. And so over time, I just consistently recognized that we trick ourselves, whether, consciously or not, to think that people are successful kind of in this overnight fashion. And it has to do with the way our media works. But once I realized that, oh, in fact, the most likely way to succeed is to actually do what all these other people did, which is work really hard for a really long time. And within that, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs. That kind of influenced my want to create that article, because I recognized that I was not the only one that had this probably unhealthy view of success, in that, we wanted it, we strive for it, but we didn't actually understand the mechanics of how everyone else got successful. Or maybe we understood it, but it didn't really like settle in. And for that reason, when, if you don't understand that mechanic and you think that really success is a more immediate thing, when you're having a low point, right, which I was having like, one of those like local minima at the time, that feels way worse, right? And you can't imagine yourself on that kind of up and down journey that hopefully over time moves in the right direction. And so that's why I wrote it, because I recognize like I can't be the only one who's feeling this way, right, about seeing success around me and not feeling it with my own work. And so I wrote it, and apparently I was right about that hypothesis, because so many other people were like, I needed this. In fact, a lot of people have reached out to me about the article, but one in particular, I don't know if he ever did it, but one guy was like, this resonated with me so much, I'm getting it tattooed. And I was like, thanks, but like, please don't get my article tattooed. Like, you're going to regret that, dude. But anyway, that's what I was thinking when I wrote it.
Makes complete sense. What is local minima and maxima? I've never heard that before.
Sure.
Pardon my ignorance.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I didn't. That's my bad for using terms that I guess, yeah, some people don't encounter as much. But it's a math term, right? Or at least the way that I know it is through mathematics. So if you imagine just like a graph, right? And imagine like literally you take a pen, and on that graph you draw a bunch of squiggles that go from left to right, and they go up and down and up and down and up and down. Somewhere in there's going to be a global maximum and a global minimum, right? So what's the absolute highest across this entire curve that exists, and then also what's the global minimum, which would be the lowest point, right? But within that, there's going to be a bunch of different other points, right, that happen, a bunch of different what we call local maximum or minimums, or minima is like the proper plural for it. But in any case, the idea is that within your life, and you can imagine this, like even if you have an extremely successful life, imagine drawing the curve of your life. It's going to look like a bunch of mini ups and downs that hopefully over time, like trend in the right direction. But the idea of this like local minima or maxima is that within a specified period of time, there may be some section where you are at the bottom within that segment, right? Or you may be at the top within that segment. But if you expand your horizon past that segment, you're almost certainly not at the global maximum or minimum. And so dwelling on where you are at the local points is really unhealthy, right? Because we have this kind of like tunnel vision in the way we see our lives often. And if you focus on that, then it can be really detrimental on both sides, right? Thinking you're the absolute best or thinking that you're the absolute worst, when in reality, there's global maximums and minimums that you can reach in the future if you take a more, again, like expansive view.
You explained that so well, and it's really true, because if you think about someone you look up to or someone you aspire to be, and think about them in that position, they still have to take out the trash. They still have to do things that maybe they don't want to do. And you can get tricked into thinking that someone you look up to has all their problems solved and it's easy for them. But the truth is we're always dealing with problems. And that example that you just illustrated helps show that, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, even people who are extremely successful, they're going to have local minima and maxima. And then the other thing to mention is anyone who's super successful, one of the kind of like thought exercises that I really like that I've heard more recently, I think I originally heard it from Naval, but I don't know if he kind of came up with it, but it's the idea that like you as a human, for whatever reason, naturally compare yourselves to other humans. And we, I'll admit, like there's people that I get jealous of at particular times. I think it's a natural human emotion. But the question that you should ask yourself as you're comparing yourself to other people is literally like, would I trade my life for that person? Because you want to keep in mind that you may be jealous of, like, for example, that person's intellectual capacity, or you may be jealous of their fitness or their looks, or, whatever it is. You may be jealous of one aspect of their life, but would you actually take all of the aspects and all the intricacies of your life and trade it for their life? In most, if not all cases, the answer would be no. And so that's also something to keep in mind, that we tend to compare ourselves with other people. But in reality, most of the time those comparisons are not actually like a holistic representative view of that person.
Yeah, I love that example. And I also like to think about what that person is presenting to the world is just the external. And we have no idea what's going on in their own mind. So, yeah, I love that example.
Totally.
So, one thing that I wanted to ask you about was why you decided to code to begin with. Because when I came through your writing, I was like, wow, this woman is an incredible writer. But then I went to see that you also code, and I'm like, okay, she codes too. Like, so explain to me why you made that decision to code. You said back in 2018 you started?
Yes, exactly. I think it's funny because a lot of people, especially, I kind of like nailed myself into this with this book, but a lot of people these days refer to me as like someone I saw tweeted today was like, Steph is like the queen of content. And a lot of people think of me as a writer and all this stuff. And there's no problem with that. But I've actually never seen myself in that light, in the sense that even growing up and to this day, I've always felt more like inclined to with like data and tech and science. I did my degree in chemical engineering. I would much prefer spending my day in a spreadsheet rather than a Google document. And so that's all to say that I think writing is this amazing tool for communication. And that's why I've adhered to it, in the sense that like, it's this amazing way for me to take my thoughts and the things that I want to communicate to the world and do that. Right. But, the reason that I learned to code is kind of for a similar lane where, I have these ideas, right? And some of those ideas are communicated well in an article about how to be great, but some of them are communicated in products, for example. So one of my products is this thing called Unoya, which is a directory of words that don't translate. Now, I could and actually even did write an article about words that don't translate, but what I actually think is like a better medium to communicate this like fascination that I have with these words that don't translate, it's to just create a directory so that other people can go and engage with that. And so coding has been this amazing tool for me to, again, there are certain things that translate better to other people or communicated better to other people in different ways. So whether it's video, audio, written, through a product, through talking to someone in person versus not. And so I recognized this actually back when I was living in Bali, and a lot of the nomads who live in Bali, there's like this very significant overlap between digital nomads and kind of like indie makers. And I had met Peter and a couple other people at this, late 2017, early 2018 period. And I just realized like, man, I have all these ideas. There are all these things that I want to go create. And the kind of roadblock there was that I couldn't create them because I didn't have enough money to go hire a developer to create them. And I didn't have the skills to create them either. And then I had met people like Peter who were like, yeah, I just like wake up and like see the feature requests and I just go implement them, and I have complete control over my code base and I can create exactly what I want. And I don't have to go back and forth between these developers. And I'm like, man, that sounds awesome. And I just realized also that, again, taking that long-term horizon, code or tech in general is going to be even more influential as we move forward. And so I kind of saw it as like, man, I probably should learn this eventually. Like so in other words, I should start today. So that combination of things where it's like, I really want to create stuff. I probably will need the skill one day. And in learning the skill, I'm going to be able to create this stuff exactly how I want to create it. That kind of amalgamation of things led me to just kind of sucking it up and saying, okay, this year I'm going to learn to code.
And so what were the first steps that you took once you made that decision?
So I decided that like that was the year I was going to learn to code. Like it wasn't a kind of like rough idea of like, oh yeah, I'll learn to code soon. It was very much like 2018 is the year I'm going to learn to code. So what I did is I first created a spreadsheet that tracked, and I've said this to some people and they're like, this sounds like really intense. And it actually was basically what I did is I created a spreadsheet that tracked how often I was learning to code, and just basically like an X if I learned to code that day, if I had spent anywhere from 15 minutes to like 8 hours, but it was just an X if I had learned to code that day. And again, some people think that's like a little obsessive or intense, but I actually thought it was perfect because I have all these goals or metrics that I'm judged by in my work. right? Whether, regardless of the company that I'm at. And I found that those always trump my personal goals. So this was my effort to say, this is like a very, very concrete goal of yours, and you're actually tracking it, right? You're not just saying that as a goal. Like, I have a metric to measure myself by in learning to code. So that's what the first thing I did. And then in terms of actual stuff, there's so many ways that you can learn to code online these days. The information's all out there. I happen to take a course on Udemy called the Web Developer Bootcamp by Colt Steele. Would definitely recommend it. But again, there's dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of other stuff or other courses out there that probably would be just as good. So that's what I took. It took me to get through the whole thing, because it was a full stack course and I was working full time and all this stuff. It took me like 3 or 4 months or so, but I've given talks on this concept of learning to code. And I think it takes to start from literally zero and be able to code like full stack applications. Not at a point where you're like getting hired by companies, but where you can like go and create your own stuff and feel pretty comfortable with it. I actually think it doesn't take as long as people think. And I came up with this number based on my own experience, because I had been tracking it, which is 300 hours. And if you can spend 300 hours, I think you can get way further than you think. And if you break that down, 300 hours is equivalent to 1 hour a day for a year, right? But you can also be way slower, way quicker, right? It's the equivalent of 2 hours a day for half a year. Or if you spend basically like a full-time job commitment, you can actually learn within like a month or so. So anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent, but the idea is that, I just took a Udemy course and made it like a very clear, very measurable goal that I was going to do, or I was going to invest in just as much as I would invest in, a work-related goal or something like that.
I love that example, and I'm so happy you provided that. So I'm curious now, did you have any accountability for that goal, or was it just you versus you, or how did you think about the accountability aspect of it at all?
It's a good question, because I've never, for whatever reason, I've never really had to have accountability partners. Now, that's not to say that I don't slack off. Like, there's like many periods in my life, like right before that How to Be Great article, where I was really not creating stuff. I was really not motivated. But once I get something in my head that I just think is essential, sorry, there's a train next to me.
You're good. No worries.
So once I get an idea in my head that I think is really, really important, so in this case, learning to code, I just realized that it was not just something that I wanted to do. It was something that I saw as like a roadblock is a great analogy for this, because it wasn't like this is going to like come and go, or I may actually not need this. It was like, you cannot get past this thing in your life. Or if you try to continue your life without addressing this, it will come back, right? And so for me, it was kind of just like, you got to do this at some point, and you're going to do it now. And so I didn't actually have an accountability partner, but I had really, really solidified the why of creating it. And if anyone's interested, some book that is not scientific at all, but that I found really helpful is this book called The 4 Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. And she talks about 4 tendencies of people, and they're almost like their type of accountability, or where they respond to accountability well. And there's, so the 4 types are a 2x2 matrix of how you respond to either inner or outer accountability. So I won't go through all of them, but the idea is like upholders, for example, they respond well to both. Questioners respond well to outer accountability, obligers, respond well to outer accountability. I'm a questioner, and I respond well to inner accountability, which means in understanding, after reading this book, I was like, oh, everything makes sense now, where I'm like, I have had gym buddies in the past and flaked on them, or I have had people tell me, it's really important for you to do this, or if you don't do this, you're not going to, be healthy. And I've just been like, okay, sure, whatever. And I kind of ignore it. And as a questioner, I need to validate why something is important for me to care about it. And so that was really why, there was many years before where I was like, oh, I should probably learn to code, or I hear other people say it's important. But until I had actually really understood and gotten behind in my mind that I need to learn this, then that's the only point at which I actually did, hold myself accountable.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because when other people tell you should do something, we often, or say, yeah, whatever. But until we find it's our idea, or we are really convinced that we should do it, that's when we'll really start to take action. I can't tell you the number of people who are like, you should do a podcast. You should do a podcast. And I was like, okay, yeah, like whatever. And then it was like my idea. And I was like, I'm doing this. And then I start to.
You're like, this is the best idea ever. Like, I'm the first to come up with it.
Exactly. I love it so much that I start recording so many in the backlog. Like this episode will get released in early January and we're recording in like mid-October. And point being, like, you really start to do something when you feel like, okay, I have to do this. This is my calling. This is what I feel I should be doing, even though other people often have the idea for us way ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly. To give you a really embarrassing example of this, for a long time, for many years throughout like high school, and I think it led all the way up until, maybe end of university or something like that, maybe even after, I just am not a big fan of water. It sounds silly. Like everyone I tell this to is like, you're human and you're not a fan of water. Like I never grew up drinking much water. And I always drank like juices or tea or something. And for so long, trust me, like dozens, hundreds even of people throughout my life have been like, Steph, you're going to die when you're 30. Like you should drink water. It's like the cornerstone of biology. And I heard it so many times. And even from like a scientific perspective, I understood it, but I just never really listened. And one day, I don't even know how this happened. I can't even remember like a specific juncture, but at some point I just like something changed in my own head where I'm like, whoa, like it was almost an identity thing where I'm like, I don't want to be the type of person that doesn't drink water. Like that's crazy. Like I don't want to be the type of person that doesn't take care of myself. And something about that different point of view changed. And now I drink water all the time. Right. And so I think to your point, like you need to convince yourself, and that comes in many different ways, whether it's you think it's your idea or you just change the framing and all of a sudden it fits into your identity in a more effective way. But I think this is so true and it impacts people all the time. And the more we're conscious of that, the more that we can kind of tailor ourselves or our lives so that we're more accountable, knowing how we sometimes hinder our own lives.
Do you remember where you were when you came to that aha moment of drinking water? I'm super curious and how like when did that change? Like and how and what were you thinking and what were you previously consuming to make you think that potentially? These are just the things that I think about.
I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if there was like one specific exact moment, but I do remember it. It was something very identity based where when I say I don't like water, I don't like drink water and say, hey, this is gross. It tastes like nothing, right? Everyone can agree on that, but I never sought it out. And I, feel fine when I'm not drinking a lot of water. But obviously like anyone will tell you that's unhealthy. And so what changed is I just kind of realized that even though it was unhealthy, and for whatever reason, up until then, I was cool with it. What actually changed my mind over, again, I don't know exactly how this was influenced. I just kind of thought about things and I'm like, okay, I don't want to die when I'm 30. But more specifically, what resonated with me is like, I don't want to be the type of person that doesn't take care of themselves. And that includes like many different aspects of your life, but specifically, your health. Like I'm smart enough, I'm thoughtful enough to recognize and understand and appreciate this concept, which again, to most humans is like obvious and like table stakes. But for me, I don't know why it took me a long time to recognize that. And so now it's interesting how like, again, also your biology and your mind work together. So now I not only drink more water, but I actually enjoy it more too. I still don't love it, but I like it more than I did before, I guess I could say.
So you brought up the exercise, and one thing that I noticed about your site was that you track the number of times that you exercise and put it out there. And I thought this was so fascinating. So like, why did you decide to do that? Like you took the build in public and you were just like, I'm not just going to do this for money or revenue. I'm not going to do this just for other things like professional goals. You also take it to the personal stakes of like, I want to exercise X number of times. And so I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I think I just, like I said, from that very first project, when I realized that like building in public or sharing things openly just like brings people in, they're just like so much they want to be more involved in your life. They want to follow your story, all the stuff. I just, I had continued to do that through multiple projects and just continued to like get that positive feedback of the more you share, the more people want to get involved. And it wasn't some like super like transactional viewpoint. It was more so just like this feedback that was making me feel more comfortable sharing in public, but also that I was getting positive feedback in this reinforcement cycle. And so I think I created my open page, the page you're talking about, in end of 2018 or early 2019. And it was because I had done, so 2018, still to this day, that year where I'd learned to code is, I think, one of the most defining years of my life. And at the end of that year, I wrote an article called, I think it's like My Year of Sponge or something like that. It's kind of a dumb title, but that's what I called it. And it was because in that article, even, it was framed off of the thing I mentioned about tracking how often I was learning to code. And I shared that. A lot of people were interested in that as well. And I just realized, like, why does sharing in public have to stop at like just your professional goals or your professional company targets? I don't share super personal things online, but anything that I'd be willing to share with you or with, a stranger, why not share it online? And then, as you gain accountability with company stuff, like, revenue metrics or whatever, the same thing is true with personal stuff, where I don't know who's looking at my open page, but it does at least provide me a layer of like, this is in public and I'm going to be truthful towards it. And, that does, at least to some minor degree, make me want to, for example, exercise a little more often so I don't have a bunch of red boxes. Or, for example, I openly state my goals for 2020 or 2019. And I don't want to, I'm not going to hit all of them, but I don't want to completely, miss all of my goals once I've shared them in the open. So I do think it adds a layer of accountability. And my view on building the open, going back to something I mentioned earlier, is that I'm not adjusting my life. I'm not setting goals because I think they look more impressive on my open page. I'm more so just, again, opening that garage door so that I'm already setting this goal of trying to exercise half of the year. Why not just put it on an open page? And since I did that, it's actually amazing that of all the things I've created, the open page has been consistently one of the most popular things that people still come back to, which I built again like almost 2 years ago now. Actually, that's kind of, is that true? I think so. Yeah, I built it at the beginning of 2019 or sometime within 2019. And still to this day, I get a bunch of DMs or people messaging me being like, hey, I somehow found your open page. I don't even know how because I don't share it very much. And they're like, how do I create something similar? Or I'd love to know more about your story. And so, yeah, I've just consistently found that sharing stuff in the open has benefited me. And I think I view it as like a why not share some of these personal goals as well.
Yeah, the honesty and authenticity is what comes through in that open page. And we'll definitely link that in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/Steph. Steph, you brought up before a project that I've actually spoken to my parents about because I was so fascinated by it, and I think about it quite often, and that's Unoya. And I am fascinated by the ways in which the language we use dictates the way we see the world. And you obviously are as well, because you spent a lot more time on this project than I did in just saying that statement. But talk to me about like your favorite words that don't translate to English. And I want to hear you riff on this a little bit.
Yeah, so Unoya is exactly how you described it. It's a directory of untranslatable words. I had started to learn about just almost like this concept of untranslatable words through when I started nomading or traveling more. There's a bunch that people use, like when they say, like, what's it called? Like wanderlust is one, for example, right? And there's a bunch of other ones. I'm kind of blanking right now on some of the travel specific ones, but there's a bunch where people will use these concepts to explain a term that we don't have in English. And I've always found that kind of fascinating. And as I went down the rabbit hole of learning about more of these words, I got fascinated by the concept that you brought up, which is not just like how each one of these individual words manifests, but like this concept that within certain cultures, certain things happen more and happen at a rate that don't happen in other cultures, so much so that they have words for this thing when we don't. And if you think about that, just in terms of that concept, it's really interesting because words on their own are just tools, right? So as we experience some things, we experience reality, right, as we see it. And then as we experience certain things enough, whether it's a particular item or a particular emotion or a particular person, we have labels, right? So we have labels for the plant over there or this emotion that I'm sad. But none of that ever quite actually approximates reality. But we create these words so that we can articulate them easily, right? So that we're not stumbling trying to use 10 words in the English language to explain the billions of other things that we encounter. Now, what I find interesting is this concept that this idea of the frequency of experience in certain environments justifies the need for a word. So to give a very concrete example of that is in Japan, and Japan actually across all of the cultures seems like, at least within this database I've created, has the most untranslatable words. In Japan, they have a word, unfortunately, for basically suicide death, which is karoshi. And again, this is a really sad one, but I think it kind of it communicates what I'm trying to say, which is that in Japan, because they have this culture of overworking to the extreme at times, at least compared to other parts of the world, they have an abnormal amount of people who actually die at their desk. And for that reason, I'm sure for a long time before the word karoshi existed, they just said, hey, like another person or my cousin or whatever died at their desk. But because it was so prevalent, they eventually created this word karoshi for it. And sometimes you'll even find that these words also just have a lot more nuance, and they articulate more than just someone dying at their desk. They, for karoshi, for example, it articulates more than just like the exact scenario, but it also articulates this like phenomena of people overworking and how it's really sad and how probably something should be changed. And so I just think once you realize this, these untranslatable words communicate so much more than the exact definition that you could try to translate them in. And so I love hearing about how if you look at particular cultures, like if you go to Unoya and you search for let's say only untranslatable Japanese words, you almost get a sense of these like intricacies of that culture, right? These things that exist and happen in Japan and that people experience, so much so that they've created words for it that don't exist other places. So to give you another couple examples of ones that I really like, so to kind of give the contrast of karoshi, the Danish, I cannot pronounce this word, but they have a word which literally means work happiness. Which is the feeling of happiness provoked by a satisfying job. And the reason that I think that's also so interesting is because, again, like your words articulate an experience, but something else I talk about in an article I wrote on this is that your words also impact your experience, right? It's kind of like a cycle, in which case, if you actually have a word to articulate something, the question becomes, do you actually experience that thing either more vividly or more often? And the reason I bring this up is because there's actually been studies on, for example, if you go to my blog and you end up going in the untranslatable words article, there's examples of where people or different tribes have specific words for different types of colors that differ from, our red, blue, green, whatever. And they actually, because of that, they've done studies where they've shown people these like circles of colors, and they can identify different colors than we can, and vice versa. They see a different almost like juncture where color changes. And so you must ask, if that's true with color, if having specific words for specific types of colors makes us see different colors, how can it not be true that having words for particular experiences actually impacts the way that we experience those things and the frequency to which we experience them? So I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to go through more of these, but that's kind of how I think about it and why I find them so fascinating.
I love it. And the example that pops out to mind is a couple actually from the book Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And the first being that, we have a word for fragile, but we don't have a word for the opposite of fragile. You could have sturdy, you could have strong, but those don't really talk about something that gets stronger from disorder, and so he coined the phrase antifragile, and his whole point was that if we don't have a word to describe something, then we lose the essence of what it is. And the other is an example that he mentioned in the book, I believe, about colors as well, which was that for a long time they didn't have actual colors. I don't remember when they started naming colors, but it was fascinating that they called the ocean wine. They described it like wine instead of calling it blue. And it's just something we take for granted today, but that, hundreds of years ago they didn't have. And so it's fascinating to me, this whole subject.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't read Antifragile, but I know the concepts, and that's a perfect example of where sometimes the words that we have accessible to us just don't convey a particular experience. And if that happens enough, then a word gets created. And I think in general, the reason I find this whole idea so interesting is because it fits within something that I have believed and recognized more and more and more, is this idea that our brains, I don't know this because I'm not trained in this, but I think it comes from literally many, many, many evolutions ago, where, if you were a caveman, for example, it was helpful to bucket things in the sense that it was helpful to know if something's a predator or not a predator, right? And it was helpful for you to be able to think in dichotomies. Whereas now I think we still have a lot of the training from the past that influences us to think in dichotomies, and we struggle to think in nuance. And part of the reason I find this language stuff so interesting is because it kind of gets to some of that nuance, right? Some of that in between, some of the things that may exist somewhere else that you don't know how to experience, or you haven't experienced, or maybe you have and don't know how to convey. And so I just think it's so interesting when you get to see these shades of gray. And in general, just acknowledging that even though our language is so extensive, so impressive, it can allow us to communicate so many things, it is still a structure that someone invented that allows us to bucket things, right? And once you understand that, I think it's just this amazing rabbit hole that you can go down, where you can, again, recognize the shades of gray in everything.
Nuance is so important, especially in today's world where you feel more polarized than ever. Before I let you go, Steph, talk to me about your writing process, and talk to me about if there's anything in particular you do, how you go about writing a book, or how you go about writing a blog post. It might be different, but I'm super curious as a fellow writer to hear about your actual process.
Sure. So yeah, if anyone's curious about a more lengthy version of this, because I'll condense it, they can go to my blog and look at the article "Writing is Thinking" on there. But I preface the article, and I think this is really important, where back in high school, I actually alluded to this a little bit earlier on. I hated writing. I've never seen myself as a writer. I remember in grade 12, at least, so I grew up in Canada, you have to take English every single year up until you graduate. And it's the only course you have to take every single year until you graduate. And I remember thinking that was so annoying because I was so ready to drop English class. So that's just to give you some perspective, that a lot of people think of themselves as not writers, or they can't write. And I think what's important to recognize there is that at least within high school or traditional schools, you're taught to write a specific way, not only in terms of the structure of your writing and how you actually outline stuff and then move to another step and then move to another step, but also the things that you write about, and also how you're graded, right? Versus now I write about things that I'm curious about, and I write in my own way, and I do things on my own terms. So I think that's really fundamental, because now I love writing, and before I hated it. And I think many other people maybe have discarded writing because they, again, had a bad experience. So with that said, now what I do is acknowledging that in the past, a lot of those constraints really did not work for me. And also the constraint of, in particular, writing of a particular style or anything like that, or particular structure. I don't aim for any of that. What I try to do is, again, focus on topics that I care about. And then from there, what I do is try to limit what I call the activation energy for me to get started. And so I think sometimes people also get overwhelmed, where they're like, okay, I have to write an article and I want to publish it next week. And so I better start now, and I better sit down, and I better think about what I'm going to write about. I got to research it. I got to get down my thoughts. I have to edit it. And they turn this like very complex task into something that they need to do all at once. And what I've tried to do with this idea of activation energy is like, look, if I try to do all those things at once, I'm going to be overwhelmed, and the quality of my stuff is going to be lower because I'm not doing things when I'm, I guess you could say ready for them. And so instead what I do is I have in this article I talk about it's 6 different steps. It's ideation, tracking, an outline, what I call this idea arbitrage that I'll explain in a second, research, and writing. And those are pretty arbitrary steps, but the idea is that the start of my process and the middle of it are passive. And what I mean by that is I start an article with this passive ideation phase, which just means me like listening and living and doing whatever I would do in normal life. And then if I see a tweet that sparks an idea, if I have a conversation that sparks an idea, maybe I'm in the shower and I get an idea, that's when I do write it down, and I add it to this tracking document. And I just have like literally now over 100 different articles that I range anywhere from, again, literally like a tweet where I'm like, okay, there's something there, to a pretty close to being finished article. So I have all of these running in parallel. So I create a tracking document. At some point in here, I also create an outline. And it doesn't, again, need to be a super baked out outline. I did the same for my book, in which case that was a pretty thorough outline. But creating an outline is not so that it's perfect and it's never going to change. The idea is that so that as I go into this next step, which is I call the idea arbitrage step, I have vaguely a good understanding of what I'm trying to communicate here. So that I go into this second passive state where, again, like maybe I'm talking to you and you say something and I'm like, oh, that really relates to that article that I started 4 months ago or whatever. And I just continue doing that where it's almost like that ideation step a second time. But I just like let things ruminate until I feel like I have enough there where I'm like, okay, I want to write this article. I want to finish it off, in which case I may do some additional research, like third-party research, to fill in any gaps I have. And then finally, after all that, I sit down and I write it. And when I say write it, I'm comparing this or contrasting this to everything before, where I'm writing and I'm putting stuff down. But in this case, this final step, I'm like, okay, I'm going to get this article done. I'm going to articulate exactly what I want to do. And that step I typically try to do in minimal sessions, just to kind of flex this like finishing muscle concept of just like, getting things done. Because if you don't do that, I feel like they never get done. But with that said, I guess to summarize my process is this process won't necessarily work for everyone, but the key to this process is not exactly the steps that I mentioned in exactly the right order, but that I've set it up in a way where I have, again, this low barrier to entry, where I'm just collecting ideas. I'm thinking about things that I'm interested in, so that once I actually get to the point where there's a critical mass of things that I've collected on this particular topic, it's almost like I'm excited to write it, or at least it's not overwhelming to write it, right? And so that's how I think about it, and that's how I approach it. But with one caveat I would say is just that, of course, this works for me because I'm running my own thing, and I don't have deadlines, and I don't have an editor who forces me to write a particular way. So this does change if you have to write, for a company or something like that. But that's my writing process. And again, if people are interested, they can find a more detailed version of it at my site.
Yeah, and that was really helpful, and we'll certainly have those in the show notes. And so before we wrap this conversation up, tell everyone where they could find you on the internet, Steph.
Sure, there's a train passing, so I'm just going to wait for it to...
You're good. No worries.
So you can find me online at, my site is stephsmith.io, and then my blog you can find at blog.stephsmith.io, and then my Twitter is where I'm most active online, at least, and my handle is stephsmith.io.
Awesome. And thank you so much for joining us today. Learned a bunch, and so grateful for your time and your wisdom.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Danny.
That was my conversation with Steph Smith. If you enjoyed it, let me know on Twitter. If you didn't enjoy it, also let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda. Feel free to leave a review for the show. I love hearing and seeing the new reviews. And what else? Just want you guys to have a wonderful day. Have a day filled with love and happiness and joy, and spread along the positivity. Sending you guys massive love, and I'll see you guys in the next one.